January 12, 1945. Hürtgen Forest, Western Germany. The snow had stopped falling an hour before dawn. In the pale pre-light, the forest floor lay suffocating beneath 3 feet of frozen white, a silence so complete it seemed the earth itself had forgotten how to breathe. Sergeant Klaus Richter pressed his face against the concrete observation slit of Bunker 47, his breath condensing into crystals on the icy metal rim. He could see nothing beyond the skeletal trees, their blackened trunks testimony to months of artillery fire. Behind him, in the belly of the reinforced structure, 14 men waited in darkness that smelled of wet stone, gun oil, and the acrid tang of fear aged into routine. They had held this position for 47 days. They had survived American artillery that turned the canopy into splinters. They had endured bomber runs that made the ground buck like a living thing. Their concrete walls were 3 feet thick. Their firing ports commanded perfect overlapping fields. They had ammunition, water, and the absolute conviction that no force on earth could pry them from this hole in the frozen German earth. Then at 0647 hours they heard it, a sound that didn't belong to any war they knew. Not the whistle of incoming shells. Not the grinding of tank treads. This was different. A low mechanical hiss, like a great serpent drawing breath. In the observation slit's narrow frame, Klaus saw him, a figure approaching through the morning mist, carrying a device that seemed conjured from industrial nightmare. 2 cylindrical tanks strapped to his back. A wand in his hands tipped with a nozzle. And behind that nozzle, for just one impossible second before hell arrived, Klaus saw a small pilot flame dancing in the gray dawn like a firefly that had forgotten to die. The stream of liquid fire that followed turned geometry into chaos. It didn't arc like a thrown object. It didn't travel like a bullet. It flowed, a horizontal river of orange and yellow that seemed to have weight and intention, that bent around obstacles and sought openings with an intelligence that violated every law of physics Klaus thought he understood. It hit the bunker's embrasure and didn't stop. It poured through the firing slit like water through a funnel, and in the microsecond before his world became flame, Klaus Richter understood with perfect clarity that every assumption about modern warfare his commanders had taught him was burning away in real time. This is the story of how American flamethrower teams broke not just German defensive positions, but something deeper, the psychological architecture of fortress warfare itself. It is a story written in jellied gasoline and recorded in the panicked radio transmissions of men who had believed themselves untouchable. It is a tale of technology meeting doctrine, of industrial capacity colliding with ideological certainty, and of the moment when the Wehrmacht discovered that concrete and courage were no match for a weapon that redefined the very concept of defensive security. The German faith in bunker warfare wasn't superstition, it was mathematics. Since 1942, Wehrmacht defensive doctrine had elevated the fortified position to near religious status. Engineering manuals specified reinforced concrete thickness in ratios calculated to withstand direct hits from 155mm howitzer shells. Tactical doctrine emphasized interlocking fields of fire, creating kill zones where any approaching enemy would be cut down by crossfire from multiple hardened positions. From the Atlantic Wall to the Gothic Line, from the West Wall to the desperate last positions in the Hürtgen and the bulged German defensive strategy rested on a single elegant principle. Make your strongpoint harder to destroy than the enemy's willingness to attack it. The numbers supported this faith. A properly constructed bunker required, on average, 7.3 tons of explosives to neutralize through conventional bombardment. A reinforced pillbox could absorb 40 direct artillery hits before structural failure became probable. Engineers calculated that for every bunker destroyed by frontal assault, Allied forces would suffer, on average, 12 casualties. The math was brutal but clear. Defensive positions didn't just save German lives, they devoured Allied ones at an exchange rate that made every yard of advance a transaction in blood. And it had worked. Through the hedgerows of Normandy, through the fortress cities of France, through every river crossing and ridgeline approach, American infantry had learned the terrible cost of bunker warfare. Squads would pin down a position with rifle fire while engineers crawled forward with satchel charges, often losing men to machine gun fire before reaching throwing range. Even when they succeeded, the explosion might only crack the concrete, forcing another team to make another approach. Hours could pass. Platoons could melt away. And at the end of it, one bunker might fall, while 3 others continued firing. The German soldiers manning these positions weren't fanatics blind to reality. They were pragmatists who had done the mathematics of their own survival. They knew the Third Reich was losing. They read the trajectories of retreat in every abandoned village. But inside their concrete sanctuaries, they possessed what every cornered man craves: time. Time for miracle weapons to arrive. Time for political fractures among the Allies. Time for winter or exhaustion or simple arithmetic to turn invasion into stalemate. Their bunkers weren't just defensive positions, they were contracts with fate, purchased in concrete and paid for in patience. Then American flamethrower teams arrived, and every equation dissolved in fire. The M2-2 flamethrower was not elegant. Weighing 70 pounds when fully loaded, it consisted of 3 pressurized cylinders, 2 containing gasoline thickened with napalm gel, 1 holding compressed nitrogen, connected to a trigger-controlled wand with an effective range of 40 meters. In the catalog of human weapons, it occupied a peculiar psychological space, too primitive to be proudly technological, too horrifying to be traditionally martial. Where artillery could be abstract and rifle fire could be impersonal, the flamethrower forced intimacy. It required its operator to approach within conversational distance before unleashing a weapon that killed not through kinetic impact but through the oldest human fear: burning alive. The men who carried them were volunteers. Not because they believed in the weapon's nobility, no one spoke of flamethrowers with the romantic language reserved for tanks or fighter planes, but because they understood its necessity. They trained at Fort Benning and Camp Pendleton, learning not just to aim but to think in 3 dimensions about how fire flows. They studied bunker construction, memorizing the placement of firing slits and ventilation ports. They practiced approaching while under fire, calculating the moment when forward movement became inevitable because turning back meant dying anyway. What made them effective wasn't fearlessness. It was a particular form of American pragmatism that Wehrmacht veterans found deeply unsettling. German soldiers were trained in ideology and obedience, in the mystical unity of blood and soil. American flamethrower operators were trained in problem-solving. They approached fortified positions the way mechanics approached broken engines, as technical challenges requiring specific tools applied at specific points. There was no romance in their method. No speeches about destiny. Just a job that needed doing, done by men who had decided that the fastest way home was through every bunker between here and Berlin. The tactical employment evolved through brutal trial. Early in the Normandy campaign, flamethrower teams suffered devastating casualties, exposed during their approach by alert German gunners who recognized the distinctive silhouette. But by the winter of 1944, doctrine had crystallized. Teams operated in groups of 3. 1 operator, 1 rifleman for close protection, 1 covering soldier with a rifle or submachine gun. They moved during artillery barrages or smoke screen deployment. They used terrain, dead ground, shell craters, destroyed vehicles, to close distance before revealing themselves. And when they struck comprehensively. A trained operator could empty both fuel cylinders in under 10 seconds, pouring 240 pounds of jellied gasoline into a fortified position in 1 sustained burst. The fire didn't just kill through direct contact. It consumed oxygen, creating a suffocating vacuum. It filled enclosed spaces with superheated gas that seared lungs and boiled blood in veins. It adhered to surfaces and continued burning, making the bunker itself an oven. Surrender became not just preferable to death, it became the only alternative to experiencing the specific horror of burning while still breathing. German after-action reports from the winter of 1945 reveal a pattern. Positions that had held for days fell in minutes once flamethrower teams arrived. Not because the concrete failed, the structures themselves often remained intact, but because the men inside made a calculation older than any doctrine. They could die maintaining a position that no longer mattered, or they could live by abandoning it. The flamethrower didn't breach fortifications through superior force. It bypassed them by making the cost of remaining higher than the shame of fleeing. Unteroffizier Friedrich Wolf recorded his experience in a letter discovered by American forces in an abandoned forward command post outside Aachen. The letter, never sent, was dated January 18, 1945. We heard stories from the survivors of the 352nd. He wrote in cramped handwriting that grew more irregular toward the end. They said the Americans had a new weapon, something that made bunkers into graves. We thought this was the usual panic of defeated men. We had survived artillery. We had survived tanks. Our position at Hill 287 commanded the approach road. 3 feet of concrete. Interlocking fire with Bunker 13 to our right, Bunker 15 to our left. We had ammunition for weeks. We believed we were secure. The attack came at dawn on January 16. Wolf described American infantry advancing under covering fire, standard tactics that his machine gunners had repelled for 5 consecutive days. Then the pattern changed. Smoke grenades burst across the approach, and in the confusion of artificial fog, the riflemen stopped advancing. Wolf's machine gun crews fired anyway, hosing the smoke with blind enthusiasm, confident that math favored defenders who could spray bullets while attackers had to find targets. Then we saw him, Wolf wrote. Just one man emerging from the smoke perhaps 20 meters away. He was carrying tanks on his back like some industrial demon. Hauptmann Steiner ordered concentrated fire. We could hear the bullets hitting him, no, not hitting him, hitting around him. He kept walking. Not running. Walking. As if he knew something we did not. What the flamethrower operator knew was that those final 20 meters were a calculated risk. At that range, rifle fire became accurate enough to be lethal, but machine gun fire paradoxically became less effective. The guns were sighted for longer distances, and their cone of fire could actually pass over a man moving in close. It was a dead zone of ballistic geometry, and American flamethrower doctrine exploited it ruthlessly. He stopped perhaps 10 meters from our embrasure, Wolf continued. I was at the observation slit. I could see his face. He looked tired. Not angry, not afraid. Just tired. He raised the wand toward our firing port, and I saw the small pilot flame. I shouted for everyone to get back, but there was nowhere to go. The bunker that had protected us became a trap. The stream of fire entered through a 6-inch by 18-inch opening. It splashed against the rear wall and spread, following air currents and gravity, seeking the lowest points of the floor and the highest points of the ceiling simultaneously. The temperature inside the bunker reached an estimated 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit in under 4 seconds. 8 of Wolf's 14-man crew died without reaching the exit. The others, including Wolf, burst from the rear entrance with their uniforms smoking, hands raised, screaming surrender in English they'd never formally learned but somehow knew Americans would accept. The entire assault took perhaps 2 minutes, Wolf wrote. 5 days we held that position. 2 minutes to lose it. But this is not what haunts me. What haunts me is that the American with the fire weapon did not celebrate, did not shout or boast. He simply moved to the next bunker while his comrades covered him. As if burning us out was no different than any other work. As if our fortress, our sacrifice, our courage, as if none of it mattered at all against a man with a tool and a job to finish. The psychological impact rippled through German defensive positions faster than tactical intelligence could explain. Radio intercepts from late January 1945 recorded frantic communications between bunker crews reporting not contact with flamethrower teams, but rumors of contact elsewhere. Forward observers reported abandonments of defensive positions before American forces had even begun their approach. Wehrmacht discipline, legendary in its rigidity, began developing cracks around the specific terror of jellied gasoline. Part of this was the nature of flame itself as a weapon. Bullets killed quickly or missed cleanly. Artillery was catastrophic but impersonal. Fire occupied a different psychological category. It wasn't just lethal, it was transformative. It didn't kill you, it unmade you. The Wehrmacht had trained its soldiers to face death with various degrees of stoicism, but no training manual addressed the specific horror of burning. No ideology made it noble. The Eastern Front had taught German soldiers to fear winter and Soviet determination. The Western Front now taught them to fear the hiss of igniting fuel and the sight of smoke canisters that preceded American flamethrower teams. But there was something deeper disturbing the Wehrmacht's psychological foundation, something Friedrich Wolf's letter captured: the casual efficiency of the American approach. German propaganda had painted American soldiers as soft, undisciplined, motivated only by material comfort and lacking the spiritual steel of the Lancer. Yet here were men volunteering to carry 70 pounds of explosive fuel into machine gun fire, approaching bunkers with the methodical precision of factory workers processing an assembly line. They didn't hate. They didn't rage. They simply solved problems, and you were the problem being solved. This pragmatism violated German military philosophy at its core. The Wehrmacht's entire tactical culture was built on concepts of will, willpower, force of will, triumph of will. Their soldiers were taught that superior spirit could overcome material disadvantage. Their officers believed that fanatical defense could blunt superior numbers. But flamethrower teams operated in a moral universe where spirit was irrelevant. Your courage didn't matter. Your ideological conviction didn't matter. Your concrete was just concrete, your bunker just a box, and the jellied gasoline would flow in regardless of what you believed or how bravely you believed it. Captured German officers expressed a particular resentment toward the weapon, calling it uncivilized and barbaric in prisoner interrogations, curious accusations from representatives of a regime implementing industrial genocide. But their objection wasn't really moral. It was ontological. The flamethrower broke the aesthetic rules of how they believed war should function. Artillery barrages could be heroically endured. Machine gun fire could be courageously faced. But what glory existed in dying by fire in a concrete box? What story could be told that made such death meaningful? The flamethrower didn't just kill German soldiers, it killed the narrative framework they used to make sense of dying. By February 1945, Wehrmacht defensive doctrine began quietly changing. Orders filtered down from Army group commanders de-emphasizing static defense in favor of mobile resistance. This wasn't presented as adaptation to American flamethrower tactics. Admitting as much would concede that superior German engineering had been defeated by American industry. Instead, it was framed as dynamic defense in depth and flexible response. But frontline troops understood. The bunkers they'd been told were impregnable had become pyres. The concrete sanctuaries had become ovens. And somewhere in the gap between what they'd been promised and what they'd experienced, faith in defensive warfare itself had burned away. The American soldiers carrying flamethrowers paid a different price. Operators had a battlefield life expectancy measured in days, not weeks. The fuel tanks on their backs were unarmored and highly combustible. A single bullet in the right location could turn the carrier into a human torch. German snipers learned to target the distinctive silhouette. Machine gunners prioritized flamethrower operators above all other threats. To carry the M2-2 into combat was to wear a target that every enemy soldier could recognize and would prioritize. Yet the volunteers kept coming. In letters home, in oral histories recorded after the war, they explained themselves with a logic that was quintessentially American. They wanted it over. Not victory in the abstract, not ideology, not revenge, just done. Finished. Ended so they could go home. The flamethrower, for all its horror, accomplished in 2 minutes what conventional assault might require 2 hours to achieve. It saved American lives by risking the operator's life at a higher rate. It was a brutal equation, but one that made sense to men who had learned that fairness was a luxury and survival required accepting unfair mathematics. Sergeant Robert Chin, a flamethrower operator with the 2nd Infantry Division, wrote to his sister from a field hospital in March 1945, "You asked me how I can do what I do. I'll tell you what I told the chaplain. Those men in those bunkers will kill my friends if they get the chance. They've already killed friends I'll never see again. I can spend an hour getting them out, during which they'll kill more of my friends, or I can spend 2 minutes getting them out with fire. I choose 2 minutes. Does it make me a monster? Maybe. But I'll be a monster who gets to see you again, and my friends will get to see their families." The Germans built those bunkers. They chose to stay in them. I'm just the man who makes their choice have consequences. This moral pragmatism, this willingness to accept the title of monster if it meant survival, represented a particular American approach to industrial warfare. Where German doctrine elevated sacrifice as spiritually purifying and Japanese military culture venerated death over surrender, American tactical thinking remained stubbornly transactional. The point wasn't to die well, it was to make the other bastard die for his country, as Patton had crudely but accurately articulated. The flamethrower was the logical extension of this philosophy, a weapon that traded honor for efficiency, glory for speed, and accepted that war was fundamentally a dirty business best concluded quickly. But the weapon left marks on those who carried it. Post-war psychological studies of flamethrower operators revealed higher rates of combat trauma than standard infantry. Not because they suffered more, though they did, but because of what they'd inflicted. Shooting a man at rifle range allowed psychological distance. Operating a flamethrower required watching human beings burn, hearing them scream, smelling them cook. It was intimate in ways that violated every protective dissociation the mind constructs to survive combat. Many operators described recurring dreams. Not of combat itself, but of the moment before, of approaching bunkers while knowing what they were about to do. Of carrying the weapon through villages while German civilians watched with expressions that mixed hatred and terror. Of the weight on their backs that was both physical burden and metaphorical cargo. The knowledge that they had volunteered to be the man who brought fire. Yet in interviews decades later, when asked if they regretted their service, the majority said no. Not because they gloried in what they'd done, but because they'd done what they'd calculated was necessary. They had made the brutal arithmetic work. They had survived. Their friends had survived at higher rates than friends in other units. And they had helped end the war faster than any alternative they could imagine. It wasn't a good answer. But it was an honest one, and honesty was perhaps the only virtue that mattered when discussing weapons designed to burn men alive. The symbolic weight of the flamethrower extended beyond its tactical utility. In the iconography of American material abundance that so disturbed Axis powers, it represented a particular nightmare, the weaponization of industrial capacity itself. The M2-2 wasn't technically sophisticated by the standards of 1945 military hardware. It was brutally simple: pressurized tanks, napalm gel, ignition system. What made it effective wasn't clever engineering but sheer availability. American factories produced flamethrowers at scales that Wehrmacht logistics officers would have considered logistically impossible. By early 1945, frontline units could requisition flame weapons with the same casual expectation they requisitioned machine gun ammunition. This abundance terrified German soldiers in ways that individual tactical defeats did not. It suggested an enemy with such overwhelming industrial capacity that they could afford to be wasteful with specialized equipment. They could afford to have flamethrower teams operating at the squad level. They could afford to expend 240 pounds of jellied gasoline to clear a single bunker. They could afford to treat one of history's most feared weapons as just another tool in an inexhaustible arsenal. In captured German propaganda materials from early 1945, the flamethrower appears with increasing frequency as a symbol of American barbarism. Posters showed grotesque caricatures of American soldiers wielding flames against helpless defenders. Radio broadcasts declared that the use of flame weapons proved American moral bankruptcy, that a nation resorting to such horror had abandoned all civilized standards. But beneath the propaganda's shrillness, one can detect something closer to despair: the recognition that an enemy who could field such weapons in such numbers possessed resources beyond matching. The napalm gel itself became its own symbol. Developed by Harvard chemists in 1942, it was a mixture of naphthenic and palmitic acids combined with gasoline to create a substance that stuck to surfaces and burned at temperatures exceeding 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. It was fire made adherent, given weight and direction, transformed from elemental chaos into directed weapon. And it was American, not in the sense that only America could have invented it, but in the sense that only American industrial chemistry could produce it at a scale where frontline flamethrower operators never worried about supply. German soldiers familiar with their own military's chronic shortages, of ammunition, of fuel, of winter clothing, of food, found this abundance psychologically crushing. They had been taught that German efficiency and organization would overcome Allied material advantages. They had believed that discipline and skill could substitute for industrial capacity. The flamethrower, appearing in numbers that seemed to multiply daily, burning through defensive positions with jellied gasoline that never seemed to run out, was a daily refutation of everything they'd been told. It whispered a truth that German propaganda couldn't suppress: you are fighting a country that has so much of everything that it can afford to burn you alive wholesale, and it will never run out of fire. In Friedrich Wolf's unsent letter he wrote, "They say Germany makes the best steel, the finest engineering. Perhaps this is true. But America makes enough. Enough bullets, enough tanks, enough bombs, enough fire. They defeat our quality with their quantity, and I begin to understand that quantity is its own quality. A weapon that appears once can be heroically opposed. A weapon that appears everywhere, always, supplied forever, this cannot be fought. This can only be fled." The Hurtgen Forest Campaign, where Klaus Richter had watched fire approach his bunker, lasted from September 1944 to February 1945. It was among the longest battles fought by the U.S. Army in World War II, and among the costliest. Approximately 33,000 American casualties in exchange for 50 square miles of devastated woodland. Military historians debate whether the campaign was necessary, whether the objectives justified the cost, whether alternative strategies might have achieved the same results with less bloodshed. But within that larger strategic debate lies a smaller, grittier truth. Flamethrower teams changed the pace of the Hurtgen's endgame. Bunker complexes that might have required days of preparatory bombardment followed by costly infantry assault fell in hours once flame teams arrived. Defensive positions that Wehrmacht doctrine said should hold until relieved or overrun held only until the hiss of pressurized fuel announced that relief was not coming and overrunning was no longer necessary. The choice was surrender or burn. Records from the 22nd Infantry Regiment document the tactical evolution. In November 1944, clearing a fortified area required an average of 47 hours and cost 23 casualties per bunker complex neutralized. By January 1945, with flamethrower teams fully integrated into assault doctrine, the average had dropped to 6 hours and 8 casualties. The concrete hadn't gotten weaker. The German soldiers hadn't become less determined. But the weapon that made remaining inside a bunker deadlier than emerging from it had changed the fundamental calculus of defensive warfare. This is not to glorify the flamethrower or minimize its horror. It is to recognize that in the specific tactical context of Northwest Europe in the winter of 1945, it accomplished its design purpose. breaking static defensive positions quickly enough to maintain operational momentum. It saved American lives, not in the abstract or the aggregate, but in the specific sense that soldiers who would have died assaulting Bunker 47 on day 3 survived because Bunker 47 fell on day 1. Whether this justifies the weapon's use is a moral question beyond the scope of historical analysis. But that it achieved its tactical objective is simply factual. What German defenders experienced in those final months, the psychological collapse of fortress warfare, the panic that Friedrich Wolf described, the abandonment of positions before flamethrower teams even arrived, this was not cowardice. It was adaptation. They were learning at visceral speed that the rules of war had changed, that concrete could not save them, that courage could not insulate them, that the only rational response to a weapon that turned bunkers into ovens was to not be in bunkers when the weapon arrived. But by the winter of 1945, there was nowhere else to be. The Third Reich had been pushed back to its own borders. Every defensive line was supposed to be the last one. Every bunker was manned by soldiers told that here, finally, the advance would stop. And then American flamethrower teams would arrive, walking through machine gun fire with that terrible patient competence, carrying tanks of jellied gasoline that American factories had supplied in quantities that seemed to mock the very concept of scarcity, and the last line would become the next to last line, and the retreat would continue, and the war would grind forward, 3 minutes per bunker, toward its inevitable conclusion. April 1945. The war's final weeks. Sergeant Klaus Richter survived his bunker's immolation, surrendered with second-degree burns, and spent 2 weeks in an American field hospital before transfer to a POW camp. In an interview conducted by American intelligence officers on April 29, hours before Hitler's suicide, though no one present knew it yet, he spoke with the exhausted candor of a man who'd stopped caring what his answers cost him. "The fire was not the worst part," he said through a translator. "The worst part was before. Watching him walk toward us. Knowing what was coming. Understanding that everything we'd built, everything we'd believed about how to fight, meant nothing against a man with a tool he knew how to use. We were not defeated by better soldiers. We were defeated by better equipment, better supply, better systems. The Americans did not need to be braver than us. They only needed to have more. And they always had more." The translator asked if he blamed the American soldiers. Blame? Klaus seemed confused by the word. No. They were doing their job. I blame whoever decided we should fight America at all. You cannot defeat a country that produces flamethrowers like we produce propaganda. You cannot win a war against an enemy who solves being unable to break your bunkers by simply making your bunkers irrelevant. We fought bravely. We held our positions. We did everything doctrine demanded. And it made no difference. That is what I will remember. Not the fire. The irrelevance. This sentiment, the demoralization that comes not from defeat but from realizing your defeat was foreordained by material factors beyond any individual's courage or skill, appears repeatedly in late-war German accounts. It wasn't that American soldiers were supermen. It was that they represented a system that could take ordinary men, give them extraordinary tools in inexhaustible quantities, and thereby make individual heroism economically inefficient. The Wehrmacht had built an army around the concept of elite soldiers achieving decisive results through superior will and skill. The American military had built a system around the concept that sufficient resources properly applied could make elite skill unnecessary. The flamethrower was that philosophy made literal. It didn't require exceptional bravery to use, though operators needed courage enough. It required good training, proper support, and above all, supply. The American military provided all three at scales that German logistics could never match. By war's end, American forces had employed approximately 25,000 flamethrowers across all theaters. German forces had produced roughly 1,500 of their own flame weapons during the entire war. The disparity wasn't in technical capability. German Flammenwerfers were arguably superior in range and reliability, but in industrial philosophy. Germany built quality weapons in limited quantities. America built adequate weapons in unlimited quantities. And in industrial warfare, adequacy multiplied by infinity beat perfection multiplied by scarcity every single time. The M2-2 flamethrower was retired from U.S. military service in 1978, replaced by more sophisticated incendiary systems and eventually by thermobaric weapons that achieved similar effects through different mechanisms. Museums display them now behind velvet ropes, their fuel tanks empty, their wands pointed at nothing, their capacity for horror safely contained in historical context. Veterans who operated them are in their 90s now, if they survive at all, and their stories carry the weight of men who did terrible things for necessary reasons and have spent lifetimes uncertain whether necessity justifies terror. But in the winter of 1945, in the frozen forests and shattered towns of Western Germany, the flamethrower was simply a tool that worked when other tools failed. It broke bunkers in minutes that might have held for days. It saved American lives by spending German ones at a rate that tactical logic deemed efficient. It turned the Wehrmacht's faith in concrete and firepower into a liability, teaching the brutal lesson that no fortress is impregnable if the enemy is willing to bypass strength by exploiting inevitable weakness. The fact that men need air to breathe and fire consumes air, and concrete cannot protect you from suffocation any more than it can protect you from burning. What Klaus Richter saw approaching through the snow that January morning was not just a weapon but a symbol of industrial capacity meeting military necessity, of American pragmatism confronting German ideology, of quantity matching more than quality when quantity reached overwhelming scale. The man carrying the flamethrower was not exceptional. He was not superhuman. He was an ordinary soldier with extraordinary equipment, supplied by factories that never stopped producing, supported by logistics that never failed, embodying a system that had decided bunkers were problems and solved problems by throwing resources at them until the problems stopped existing. The fire that poured through Bunker 47's embrasure burned for perhaps 20 seconds. The screams lasted longer. The surrender was immediate. And across 1,000 similar bunkers in 100 similar forests, the same scene repeated with mechanical efficiency. American flamethrower teams approaching, German soldiers calculating odds, the hiss of igniting fuel, the choice to flee or burn. By April, the choice was being made before the Americans even arrived. Positions were abandoned at rumors of flame weapons. Defensive lines collapsed not to superior force but to superior logistics, to the understanding that America could afford to burn them out one bunker at a time and would never run out of fire to do it with. This is what panic looks like in military terms. Not screaming chaos but cold calculation concluding that resistance is mathematically futile. Not cowardice, but cost-benefit analysis determining that the only winning move is not to play. The Germans panicked when American flamethrower teams cleared bunkers in minutes because those minutes revealed a truth that shattered doctrine and morale alike. That all their preparation, all their concrete, all their courage meant nothing against an enemy with infinite resources and the willingness to use them. They panicked because they finally understood what they were fighting. Not an army, but an industrial system that had decided they were a problem to be solved, and was solving them with the methodical efficiency of an assembly line processing defective parts. The flamethrower didn't just clear bunkers. It cleared illusions. The illusion that will could overcome material, that quality could defeat quantity, that there was any way to win a war against an opponent who could afford to burn you out wholesale and never worry about running out of fire. In the end, that was the flame's truest victory, not the bunkers it cleared or the resistance it broke, but the belief it incinerated, the belief that Germany could somehow still prevail against the vast, indifferent, inexhaustible machinery of American industrial war. And when the last bunker fell and the last position was abandoned and the last German soldier emerged with hands raised from concrete that could not save him, what surrendered with him was not just a man or a position or even an army, but an entire philosophy of warfare that had discovered, too late, that all the courage in the world cannot stand against a nation that has so much of everything that it can afford to burn its enemies alive and never count the cost in anything but time saved and lives preserved and problems efficiently solved. That is the lesson written in jellied gasoline across the frozen fields of 1945. That abundance is its own form of power, that logistics defeats valor, and that the only thing more terrifying than an enemy who hates you is an enemy who doesn't need to hate you because they have the tools to defeat you regardless of how you feel or fight or believe. The flamethrower taught that lesson in minutes. Germany learned it in flames. And the knowledge burned longer than any fire could.